The Eurodollar itself is strictly medium of exchange and unit of account and almost no store of value. The store of value has been offshored literally to financial markets like bonds and stocks and all sorts of financial products, derivatives, and things like that. So there is the case to be made that store of value does not necessarily need to be tied up in a good medium of exchange. And maybe that's sort of the point here, is that we should shoot for, let's perfect or at least get as close as we can to an ideal medium of exchange before worrying about store of value. Because in the last 15 years, it's the medium of exchange function that is primary. That's the primary problem here. And let's deal with that before we think about store of value. And I think some of that's been mixed up over the last 15 years, misunderstanding the monetary system as it actually is.
Yeah, that's quite interesting because people talk about the kind of evolution of a form of money, that it is a collectible, then it is a store of wealth, then it's a medium of exchange, then it's a unit of account. I can't remember. Is that the exact order? Have I got the order right? It's something like that. But you're actually saying let's separate medium of exchange from...
Not even reorder them.
Or reorder. yeah. But that idea that you separate medium of exchange from store of wealth, which, by the way, I kind of do at the moment, in that Bitcoin is my store of wealth. And the pound or the dollar when I'm here as my medium of exchange. I sometimes use my Bitcoin as a medium of exchange, but very rarely. I do have these two separate forms of money that do two separate things for me. There are some people that believe that Bitcoin can do both, and you would be fundamentally disagreeing with that.
Not fundamentally. I think in practice. In practice, because it's fixed, because there's uncertainty about the number. And when you have a fixed monetary exchange, you make price unpredictable. Right. I think that's one of the biggest problems, although apart from lack of widespread use of Bitcoin as a medium. But if Bitcoin became acceptable in a much wider economic and commercial footprint, then it could be a medium of exchange. I'm not against that at all. I think there are drawbacks to the way Bitcoin is designed. I think it represented a very good step forward in finally thinking about the monetary system and doing something alternative. But I'm not sure it's an ideal or even a close to ideal medium of exchange. And given that that is our primary problem, I think maybe that's where we should focus first and then worry about store of value and everything else later. So it may be that you have a hybrid system where we have medium of exchange is something else and then store of value because it's fixed. Scarcity always creates value, and value is really the point here, that Bitcoin becomes the store of value. And maybe there's some form of convertibility between the two forms.
Interesting. Okay, well, let's get into the Eurodollar. And like I'm five. Explain to me like I'm five, because I have done my research and I have tried to understand it, but I can't. I just cannot get my head around what the Eurodollar is.
Well, that's the thing. There is no Eurodollar. And then even the term itself sort of lends itself to that sort of misunderstanding. It's not like there's physical stacks of paper with just a different picture of an offshore president or something on them. There's no currency. It's a ledger-based system. But what has happened is that...
Well, where did it come from? How did it...
Nobody really knows, to be honest with you. There's all sorts of origin stories. Ironically enough, the Soviet Union not wanting their dollars to be confiscated by, President Kennedy or Eisenhower back then, started storing these dollars in European banks. There's also vagaries of the breakdown of the British mercantile system, and especially after the Suez Crisis in the 50s, where more and more the world stopped using pounds and started using dollars. But to transmit transactions, to transmit currency across the world, it was easier to do it on a ledger-based system, especially with the communications technology. You could send a telex around the world at the speed of light and then have that settle a transaction. And we don't need to wait for currency to be exchanged physically from one place to the next. So as long as we have these institutions that we all agree on are good people, or at least going to follow accounting rules and internal conventions, we allow them to keep this ledger system. So instead of me giving you a physical Federal Reserve note, say a $5 bill to pay for something, transacting from one country to the next, we just have a couple banks keep track of who owes what. So it's a ledger virtual currency system maintained by the banking system.
So, okay. So it's a database.
Essentially, yes. It's blockchain. It's really what it was.
Well, but who maintains it?
The banks.
But what, every one of them has the same one? Everyone? How does it work? You say the banks, are these high street banks, these commercial banks?
There are banks that operate in the system. Yes, many of them started out being city banks or Swiss banks. And over, long before the Eurodollar showed up, there was this ad hoc correspondent network that existed for many decades, even centuries, going back to the, early days of the British Empire system. So banks that had transacted across the entire world had relationships where they knew each other very well. And so when the Eurodollar started showing up, or when this need to overcome Triffin's paradox in the late 50s became paramount, they just started.
Explain Triffin's paradox.
It goes back to the flaws in the design of Bretton Woods.
Okay.
Bretton Woods was the post-war monetary era, 1944. John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White said, how is the world going to work after World War II is over and the Allies win and the Axis is vanquished? And they said, we don't want it to be a purely international currency, a fiat, entirely fiat system. So they made sure that the pound and the U.S. dollar would be backed by national stores of gold. So it was, in some ways, at least apparent, it looked like the old system did. However, as Robert Triffin eventually said, there's this natural tendency or inherent paradox in that system, because you have to have, in order to have a global reserve currency, I think this is part of the thing that most people misunderstand. What is a global reserve currency system? What is it supposed to do, and how is it done? How is it actually accomplished? And to have a global reserve currency means having a global currency that's useful in enough places, and enough of that currency available in enough places that very different economies, very different systems can intermediate through that currency very easily. And to do that, you need to have currency, if it's an international reserve currency, in excess of the national reserves backing it. So what Robert Triffin said is, for example, the US dollar, by using that as a reserve currency, that meant there needed to be US dollars in enough places around the world that there would be more US dollars than there are gold backing it inside the United States. And eventually, because it's convertible, people would convert their US dollars outside the US for gold inside the US, draining the US of its gold, therefore eventually leading to complete chaos and unbacked currency, which is exactly what happened in the late 1950s. The US lost a ton of gold because there was a lot of these dollar balances outside the US in order to mediate this wave of economic globalization, financial linking, trade, and everything else. So the global US dollar system, this Eurodollar system, was essentially a way to work around tying the currency outside the US to national stores of gold and reserves. Right. So it was a way to circumvent all that and do so in a very clandestine, quiet manner that nobody in the public really actually caught on to it.
Right. So say Jeff, I've got my bank here in London, and I've got Eurodollars in my bank, and you've got your bank, and say you're in France and you've got your Eurodollars. How do we keep each other honest? If I send Eurodollars to you, how do you know I have those in my system? Are we all sharing one database?
Essentially, yeah. It's not really a database, especially in the early days. It's more about reputation. It's about traders back then knew everybody else's businesses. So if you were doing something wrong, if you were just conjuring, outside the rules or outside your own conventions, we would know about it, and we would no longer transact with you, and you would be out of business.
But how would you know the balance I claim to have was my actual balance? I could just put a little bit more in there. How would you know?
In terms of
Eurodollars, you say, because essentially, if it's a distributed ledger, we all know how many Eurodollars are in the system, and at the end of each day, I transact with other banks and I settle my Eurodollars with them, and vice versa. How do we all know who actually has what? Does everyone
double accounting?
Oh, it was done through double accounting.
Yeah, so your numbers have to match my numbers, which match the guy over here and the guy. We're all basically, there may be a bunch of participants in the system, but everybody's numbers have to match at the end of the day. And if they don't, they get settled in other ways. There are internal conventions, ad hoc associations where you have to follow the rules. And if bankers don't like you, they'll kick you out of the association. You're out of business. So it's essentially an honor system.
An honor system. Okay. And how does liquidity go into it?
It's created by that system.
But how? Explain to me how.
Balance sheet expansion.
Okay,
so
keep going.
This is where it gets really complicated. So if we're operating on a ledger money system that's internal, what expands the ledger? In something like blockchain, it's hard coded into the blockchain, right?
You can't expand it unless you mine more Bitcoin.
Exactly. Yeah. But in another distributed ledger other distributed ledger system, you can expand the ledger based on everybody is agreeing that the ledger has been expanded. So if I say, for example, no different than a fractional reserve lending system, that I have assets and liabilities that I want to add to my balance sheet, that I'm going to create some form of transaction that does both of those things. So if we transact back and forth between, say, you're a bank in some other location that wants to borrow dollars, I can create them in the same way that any other fractional reserve system creates dollars, by creating a deposit liability and a cash asset. But it's not actually cash. It's cash and equivalents. If you've ever read balance sheets of banks or balance sheet statements in banks, they always have that little word, the and equivalents after there, because there isn't cash here. So it's all about creating assets, double accounting, and offsetting liabilities.
Right. So if that bank wants to create loans, say
Yes.
they want to loan a business $1 million, that creates both an asset and a liability.
Right.
But they're essentially printing money to create that loan.
Out of thin air.
Right. And if that loan fails
Then you have a balance sheet issue.
And is that something that happens?
Yes, absolutely.
But this just sounds like a system, like a all boys club. We can
Yes.
just create money as we need.
Yep.
The portfolio that performs in one economic regime can get crushed in the next. So in this free webinar, we're going to reveal what those 4 economic regimes are, how to identify them, as well as the assets, historically speaking, best positioned to perform in every environment. So reserve your seat now and learn how to prepare your portfolio before the economy shifts again.